United States, as you might remember, was shut down at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. That started actually under Trump with the guidelines in March of 2020. They declared that in order to slow the spread, that the nation would have to self-quarantine for 15 days. Do you remember this? Then we were told 15 days? That's not enough to flatten the curve. We need to quarantine longer. The economy began to fail. Trillions were given in coronavirus bailouts. The American people, based on those trillions, were given crumbs. They were sending the money to like gender studies in Pakistan and crazy things like that. The American people were given very little. Teachers refused to return to school. Children were forced to learn from home. Any business declared as non-essential was closed. And that was extended even to the forced closure of churches. Other people lost their livelihoods, while big corporations were deemed essential and saw their sales boom. Even prisons in some states, like New York, were emptied under the narrative that the jails could become super spreader sites. Now, as all of this happened, politicians were seen eating at restaurants with their families. Elite parties were held where only the servers wore face masks. And while the country was locked down, mass BLM protests were allowed to sweep the country with waves of destruction under the narrative that the fight for racial justice was more important than the fight for public health safety that everyone else was facing this for. When things gradually began returning to normal, it was still very far from normal. Children were forced to wear face masks all through the school day. Vaccine mandates were rolled out. Many Americans were forced to get injected with experimental shots with really shoddy health data against their will. And that was rolled out alongside election reform campaigns, mass censorship, heavy-handed public criticism of anyone who dared step out of line. And 3 years later, well, folks, finally things are going back to normal. The vaccine mandates are ending. The public health emergency has officially ended. And the Atlantic called for a pandemic amnesty, where all of us just forgive and forget. All the people who violated our rights just move on. And people were, of course, very unhappy about that. The public doesn't want to just move on. Instead, there are now calls for justice to ensure that none of this ever happens again. And as the public calls for justice, something new is happening. Key people who were responsible for these public abuses are trying to flip the script. They're trying to rewrite history and shift the blame. And it seems like they're hoping the public just simply forgets what actually took place. Take, for instance, former White House Chief Medical Advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's been a focal point of a lot of this criticism and the accompanying calls for justice. Back in December, for example, Elon Musk declared on Twitter, "My pronouns are prosecute/Fauci." And with the 1.2 million likes on that post, he added this, "Truth resonates." Florida Governor Ron DeSantis had this to say about Anthony Fauci.
You have people like Fauci saying that his lockdowns didn't cause any permanent damage to any young kids. I got news for you, it did, and we are going to reap those rewards across the whole country for years and years and years because they treated kids so poorly. And I'm just sick of seeing him. I know he says he's going to retire. Someone needs to grab that little elf and chuck him across the Potomac.
Fauci responded to a lot of this criticism in a recent puff piece from the New York Times Magazine. He said that with the pandemic policy, quote, "nothing was done perfectly." And he washed the hands of the institutions that were mainly calling the shots by stating, quote, "the emphasis strictly on the science and public health, that is what the public health people should do. I'm not an economist. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is not an economic organization. The Surgeon General is not an economist. So we looked at it from purely a public health standpoint." And he added, "When people say Fauci shut down the economy, it wasn't Fauci. It was the CDC. It was the organization that made those recommendations. I happen to be perceived as the personification of recommendations. But show me a school, that I shut down. And show me a factory that I shut down. Never. I never did. I gave a public health recommendation that echoed the CDC's recommendation, and people made a decision based on that. So, Fauci didn't shut down the economy. Well, look, technically he didn't flip a switch somewhere that just locked down businesses across the nation. He didn't personally close down a school or, personally put up a sign closing down a factory. But yes, as he notes, he gave the recommendation. The CDC echoed that recommendation. And the policies that shut down the country, they were based on his recommendation given from his position in power. Now, it's like a president starting a war and then saying, I didn't go to war, because he never physically set foot on the battlefield. You get me? There's a big difference, at least in terms of how he's saying it, between physically carrying out an order and being the one who pushed for the order in the first place, and that's the play on words you're seeing here. When it comes to the lockdowns, Fauci, by his own admission, was the one who gave the recommendation for the order. Let me show you. This is Fauci on CNN just 13 days ago, April 26, 2023.
There was a personification of me as a person who essentially closed everything down. Those were public health recommendations that came from the CDC, and I have always been very supportive of the CDC.
Well, that's his current statement. But this was Fauci a few years ago, on October 6, 2020, during a live forum.
And when it became clear that when we had community spread in the country with a few cases of community spread, this was way before there was a major explosion like we saw in the Northeastern corridor driven by New York City metropolitan area, I recommended to the president that we shut the country down.
You get that? He took credit for giving the recommendation to shut the country down. Now, of course, it's not just Fauci. Many people were involved in the lockdowns and the abuses. And some of the biggest victims of these policies were America's children. Randi Weingarten, head of the American Federation of Teachers, recently testified before Congress on some of the decisions that were made for these schools. Now, she recently claimed that the teachers union had actually pushed early on to have schools reopened. Watch this.
I'm sorry, Congressman Raskin. We spent every day from February on trying to get schools open. We knew that remote education was not a substitute for opening schools, but we also knew that people had to be safe. And maybe it's because I live in New York City. I live near a hospital. Every other minute there was an ambulance. There was terror. Our members were terrified. Others were terrified. And what we were simply looking for was clear scientific guidance. And when we couldn't get it, we did it ourselves. And we worked with doctors and we worked with others. And we just tried to get it out there.
So the teachers union played a very heavy role in keeping the schools closed. Weingarten claims they really wanted to get them open as they knew the situation wasn't good for the kids. But apparently it wasn't their fault for closing the schools, since the physical decision to close things down was based on scientific guidance. Like the one from the officials who were giving the public recommendations for people like her to follow. They were acting on available information. So who's to blame? The people who carried out the action? The people who recommended the action be carried out? Or was the real problem a lack of information? Well, if that's the case, maybe we should blame groups like the World Health Organization or big tech that were restricting and censoring information that news reports, again, the ones that didn't follow the narratives, were doing. So then maybe the blame falls instead on groups that created the official narratives? Well, censorship policies followed recommendations from who? From the CDC. And that was also being fed recommendations from Fauci. Well, it seems we've gone full circle now, doesn't it? In other words, folks, the accusations are turning into a big mess of people who are all pointing their fingers at each other. And who do you hold responsible in that? None of them? Or maybe all of them? But for Weingarten, like Fauci, people were also quick to point out that her statements didn't quite seem to be genuine. Back in July 2020, Trump and his education secretary, Betsy DeVos, they released plans to reopen America's schools, the ones she said she wanted to reopen. Despite that recommendation from the top level, Weingarten was one of the biggest voices trying to stop schools from reopening. This is what she said to The Guardian when this was happening. She said, quote, "It's as if Trump and DeVos want to create chaos and want to jeopardize reopening. There's no other reason why they would be this reckless, this callous, this cruel." And she added, "Their recklessness scared people so much that now I fear a brain drain of people basically opting out of teaching because they don't want to jeopardize their own families." Now, the teacher union that Weingarten represents was also a key force in keeping the schools closed. Education Week reported this back in December 2020. They said several statewide teachers' unions, including in Illinois, Maryland, Wisconsin, have put pressure on their governors to shut down schools across the state or set clear benchmarks that dictate when districts will have to close their doors. Weingarten told the publication that before schools could open, in fact, that the unions wanted more requirements in place for things like face masks and other COVID mandates. And it's not just an American issue either. This is a global issue. And global leaders are likewise shifting the narrative as well. They're trying to alter history. Take Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, for example. Canada had some of the strictest mandatory vaccination policies around. In a recent speech, he claimed that he never forced anyone to get vaccinated.
And all of the scientists and the medical experts and the researchers, not just in Canada, but around the world, understood that vaccination was going to be the way through this. And therefore, while not forcing anyone to get vaccinated, I chose to make sure that all the incentives and all the protections were there to encourage Canadians to get vaccinated. And that's exactly what they did. We got vaccinated to a higher level than just about any other of our peer countries. And that's why we had a less deadly pandemic than most other countries.
Did Trudeau really not force anyone to get vaccinated? Well, you be the judge. This is Trudeau in August of 2021.
We have made the decision that federal public servants need to be fully vaccinated. That is something that we're also applying to everyone who gets on a plane or a train in the coming months in Canada.
And here's Trudeau again that same month in 2021.
You deserve better. You deserve a government that's going to continue to say, get vaccinated. And you know what? If you don't want to get vaccinated, that's your choice. But don't think you can get on a plane or a train besides vaccinated people and put them at risk. I need you to talk to your neighbors and talk to your friends. Talk to those folks who are still wondering whether they should get vaccinated and tell them, yes, they need to get vaccinated so we protect ourselves, protect our communities, and protect our kids who can't yet get vaccinated. That's what we need to do. I need you to get out there.
I see. He didn't technically force anyone to get vaccinated. You just couldn't use public transportation and you risked getting fired from your federal job if you refused. And then the government told your neighbors and other people to seek you out to try to force you to get vaccinated. Oh yeah, and then when the truck drivers held protests calling for an end to the vaccine mandates, Trudeau also invoked Canada's Emergency Act to crush the protests. But, back to the recent statements. Was it really the case that all the scientists and medical experts and researchers were all on board with the vaccines? All of them? Well, maybe that was partly because scientists, medical experts, and researchers faced punishment and could even lose their jobs if they said otherwise. Do you remember the narratives on how COVID misinformation was dangerous? Well, that's one way to get all the experts on board, right? And we also learned that through the release of Twitter files that the federal agencies were colluding with Twitter to suppress information on COVID-19 and on the vaccines. And that included censoring information on COVID and vaccines that was later shown to be true. It turned out that the FBI even colluded to make a blacklist of experts who went against the official narratives, who again were shown to be right further down the road. And as things stand right now, well, it looks like many of those responsible for the lockdowns, the mandates, and other abusive policies no longer want to admit their roles in it. And speaking of which, the vaccine companies themselves may not get off the hook either. In Texas, Attorney General Ken Paxton, he announced that he's investigating Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and Moderna over the deceptive practices, allegedly, that they misrepresented the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines. Folks, the public is calling for accountability. The people who may be accountable are trying to dodge the blame while pointing their fingers at someone else. But at the end of the day, guess what? Accountability is going to be necessary to ensure that we never endure again what just took place under these COVID pandemics.